I'm very happy to be here. It's a wonderful program and a great topic and a really, groundbreaking program in my view. So I'm very happy to be part of this series. And I also chatted a little bit with Rod and the others before the session. I also hope to maybe share some ideas that can help the different researchers maybe think of some things that maybe they hadn't thought of before when it comes to advocacy in specific contexts. So I hope that works out. So I'll just share my screen because I have a presentation. Is it visible?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, great.
We can see
okay,
it and
so
we can hear you well.
If you have any questions, my email address is here if you want to contact me on anything. Let me see, how do I... Okay, so I just want to explain a little bit why I'm here. The basic reason is, like Rod said, I do a lot of stuff that's closely related to what this group is doing. And it has a lot to do with the fact that I'm living in the Netherlands, to be honest. With a number of years ago, the Netherlands government deciding to invest considerable funds into advocacy in their international development programs, the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that is, it created a lot of opportunities for many civil society organizations here in the Netherlands and their so-called partners in the Global South to work on advocacy programs, and also for me to sit in on that, take part in that, developing ideas, doing research projects, doing evaluations. So it's been a great journey since 10 years and ongoing also. But as the years passed, I became more and more uncomfortable with the fact that I got to realize that I'm really speaking from a northern context, and I really need to move out of that and start looking much more how things work out in context in the global south. And I really learned from that also that there's often a huge disconnect with the way that advocacy programs are conceived over here and what's actually happening in the countries. And yeah, that's been a main interest of me for some time now. And that's also why I'm studying and publishing on these matters. Presently, also a research project with Save the Children on localization of civil society research, and also a study last year with CordAid on the way that linking between global level advocacy and country level advocacy, how that can be from a perspective of Southern organizations, taking those as a starting point. And I hope to do much more on this in the future as well. So I'd be happy also to collaborate with anybody present here, to be honest. So if you are interested, get in touch if you will. So this is just a little bit about that background. So, and I really believe that it's important to do work on advocacy in these different contexts also, because there is really quite little there. If you look at the advocacy literature, what it means to do advocacy, what's important when it comes to who does it, what kind of influence, what kind of roles can civil society organizations play to influence, but with what legitimacy, what strategies, how effective are they? It's mostly in Western contexts, and it's transnational, and then very much still focused on stable institutions with lots of space for civil society organizations to do their work without much disturbance. But we know, and that goes also, of course, for this program, that's often not really the case. Contexts are politically, culturally, socially, economically, etc., very diverse. That shapes advocacy. And we know little of that, but there are also types of contexts, different types of contexts that we have some research on. And that research also points already to some key themes that also our team here, might want to look at. So my main objective for today is to share my thoughts on that with the team, and it's a lot of different ideas throwing about, because I think there's so much opportunity. That's why I'm doing that. So I'm looking for advocacy in other contexts and see how that might help the team here. because, well, of course, this team is focusing on very important themes around humanitarian action and the role of advocacy as humanitarian, settings also can have a lot of advocacy going on. Lots of interest also increasingly away from the international arenas and into domestic context because of, well, the kind of disturbing picture around multilateralism. So increasing interest in domestic politics and also locally developed and locally negotiated solutions. Of course, there's a big, a big stream on that. And also increasing calls of, for local ownership and leadership and starting out from rights holders. So also when it comes to development discourse and ideas around that, there's lots of space for studying advocacy in different southern contexts, basically, especially and in these subnational and national settings. So in addition, I'd like to add that we do know already that context matters because there is some research already in specific contexts and that shows already some of that. So I want to discuss in this talk what this literature actually shows on how context matters, and also how that raises different types of questions, also normative questions, I'd say, as to what kind of advocacy would we actually like to support, and why is that? What's the basis for that legitimacy? So what I want to do then is to explore questions around civil society advocacy in 3 context types, which I think overlap: authoritarian / hybrid, meaning half authoritarian or democratic context, what we call fragile contexts, and humanitarian settings. So just some thoughts first on how context matters in authoritarian and hybrid contexts. Like I said, a lot of the time there's the assumption that there's actually space for civil society advocacy, but there's lots of constraints, increasing constraints in many contexts, in many different ways. At the same time, we know that even in highly constrained settings, there are ways to influence governance. And we have studies on that. There's an overview study by Gaventa and Barrett that's a little bit older. I did this recent small book, which was basically a story book that shows how that works. And there's other research also that shows how in these constricted contexts, organizations, civil society groups navigate possibilities. They identify possibilities to connect with different actors to still try and play their roles. And I'm going into that a little bit later. But there are many different ways to do that. For example, in China, Spires has shown that organizations link up with local government actors because they're interested in that, what these organizations can do for them. They contribute to their results. And the same goes for a study I did with Sial and others in India that shows that organizations allow themselves to be co-opted by government, but within this trusting relationship that they built, they then manage to insert agenda points into their work. I'll go into it more later, but these are already some instances of how, you don't need to shy away from advocacy in the constrained settings, but it does raise questions. How do you actually, identify what can be done? How to understand what's possible? When is it a right thing to do? For example, you can also see that, okay, this whole space is actually so limited and the damage to civil society by co-optation is so great that it's better not to support these things. But how we actually should assess it, there are no frameworks for that. So frameworks for understanding, assessing, figuring out how to support advocacy in these constrained settings, I think that's really interesting. And then context in fragile context. Now, one thing that advocacy in much of Western literature supposes is that, well, advocacy, civil society advocacy is outside of government conflict. There is a neutral space, an open space where there can be debate, where your voice can be heard. You represent society and insert ideas into, into government structures, for example, from society. But in fragile settings, civil society mirrors the divisions in society, and thus also the conflicts underlying fragility. So civil society organizations can very well be part of the conflicts that are there. So if you have then a situation where the state is not really able to create conditions for an autonomous civil society, so what does that mean for the roles that organizations can play? They can be very much depending on different power holders that are there, and having to be taking up the role of clients. And there can also be very fluid boundaries then between the state and non-state actors. So what civil society actually is and how it can play a role as civil society, or whether you're actually more a part of government itself, you're doing co-governance. Can it even be called advocacy? Questions like that come in. At the same time, when you do see, and I think our publications also show that organizations do seek to protect their autonomy. They're constantly reading the possibilities of situations and try to seek out what's possible, try to find space in the cracks, but also play the relations, like play different powers against each other, try to make the most of their political leverage and things like that. So how these organizations maneuver the situation is a very relevant question, and also how can we understand and see a civil society role there, or do we see something else there? Can it be called advocacy, or is it something else that we see here? Is it politics? Is it, well, something for which maybe we need a whole new framework? And maybe your program, I think, could be, playing a part in shaping that framework. I think that might be a very interesting question. And also going then into humanitarianism, what I see in the work that I did so far, and you also see it sometimes in other contexts, but I did then study in a more authoritarian context and in a more fragile setting. There are close links between advocacy service delivery and policy implementation. You see, for example, that organizations can do advocacy because they are doing service delivery. That creates legitimacy, it creates a space for engaging government, it creates trust. But you also see, and that's much less described in the literature, that advocacy in fragile settings can be very closely connected to policy implementation. Organizations do not just try to influence decision makers, they try to influence these decision makers, but they are also leaders in the policy implementation sometimes, because they are the institutions that should be carrying out the policy implementations. They may not be there. So organizations are playing multiple roles that also feed into each other. And that's also, I think, a hugely interesting question for fragile settings, but I think also fragile settings where you have humanitarian work going on, where you also have this co-governance and connections between these different activities. So there's a wide range of questions, I think, rooted in the conditions that fragility creates, but actually very little research on that. So that's also why I'm saying, this program could really be breaking ground, and and I see lots of opportunities with this focus on advocacy and of course accountability, but I'm not talking about that so much today. So there's also something I'd like to say on the way context matters in when it comes to humanitarian settings. I think the diversity of humanitarian settings is also really an interesting theme, right? The program is about affected populations, centering for a part on their advocacy and advocacy on their behalf. But what about the diversity of these affected populations that may be, consisting of partly local, partly migrants, all migrants with very different kind of backgrounds and opportunities and levels of organization, different relations in their context, different relations to the state. So these different populations may have very different opportunities and very different types of legitimacy also to do advocacy. So that is, I think, for example, interesting here. They may have very different rights and different claims to rights also. Yeah, and of course there's this very interesting literature on this, you know, this creation of citizenship through action, struggling for citizenship, struggling for this right to make claims also, which is, I think, also very interesting in the context of advocacy, because the legitimacy and influence of your advocacy has everything to do with your right to make a claim, right? So I think that's also very interesting. Yeah, and this legitimacy of advocacy can then be, you know, also challenged or accepted very differently in very different settings. So one question I think could be how and under what conditions can affected populations become what types of political actors in, you know, diverse settings with diverse populations. So just a few thoughts on humanitarian settings. So I also identified some potential other research themes when it comes to the role of context that also brings in these elements of fragility and authoritarianism. Yeah, in different settings, different spaces for advocacy can emerge. You can have an openness of authorities to governance, to advocacy, contexts for advocacy, spaces for advocacy can create it as the context actually develop and settle and institutionalize. But there can also be only some claimed spaces, some spaces outside of governance structure, or both things can be going on at the same time. If the situation is very fluid and developing, it's very unpredictable what spaces actually emerge, and that has everything to do with the, you know, capacity for people to organize, but also the way that that context actually facilitates that. So different types of groups can also come together then in different ways and complement each other. Professional and groups and INGOs, but also local groupings, social movements, and professional organizations. There's a lot of, I think, interesting things going on when it comes to how new types of alliances emerge that bring together all kinds of different actors. That has been studied for development, but I think it's also interesting to see for advocacy by civil society. Yeah, and one thing that comes in, and I think that comes in for humanitarian settings, but especially fragile settings, the roles and relations between civil society and authorities can be very fluid and dynamic. And I think, yeah, for humanitarian settings, I think we'll often definitely have that. So because the advocacy literature is so much focused on stable liberal states, we know very little about this fluidity and how it is to be understood and engaged with by anybody interested in humanitarian governance, right? So that could be a whole program in its own right. And then also, and that I think I show in our publications also, that what it means to do advocacy and the skills that it takes, the knowledge that it takes, it can be very different in specific settings like fragile and authoritarian settings. For example, one very commonly mentioned capacity for advocacy is building relations with authorities, building credibility, maintaining connections, so that you have access, right? But what if those actors change all the time? And what if you have to juggle actors who are in conflict with each other? How do you balance the risk of being part of the conflict with the need to have working relations with all kinds of actors? Such types of questions have really not been addressed at all. Well, I think they're very key to your project. Yeah, but then the strategizing, I think, that comes in, and I just to point out a little bit about authoritarian settings, what I saw in India when we did work on the disaster risk governance there, and the role of civil society in India, as you may know, is increasingly authoritarian settings. I think if you have a very big focus on working with the government and emphasizing your performance to maintain a role to do disaster risk management and serve the people in that way, and there's very little space to actually voice different people's needs or go against government understandings and priorities, how is that then still to be seen as advocacy? Are you not simply, strengthening the capacity of an authoritarian government to do disaster management, which is fine in itself, but to call that civil society advocacy is a question mark. What are our norms when it comes to how civil society can or cannot play its role? I think questions like that also come in. So, and finally, I think this is my last slide, because I understand I'm talking a lot here, maybe going a little bit too fast. Yeah, I think a third theme is, engaging the role of context, thinking in terms of opportunities and challenges. One key interest of advocates in these more challenging settings is risk management. You want to either avert or promote co-optation. How do you do that? What kind of criteria, what kind of considerations? Management of visibility, for example, organizations may continue in certain difficult settings to support social movements that counter the government while keeping themselves in the background just to avert risk, because they are much more fragile to being, shut down and their funding taken away if they are seen to be going against the government. But a social movement, which is more fluid, may be more able to do that. And that's what you see organizations doing also. Leveraging personal relations is a very common strategy to manage your risk, keeping yourself out of jail by making sure that you maintain your relation with important power holders who can keep you out. Protecting against violence and other organizational risks in that way, and also in other ways, I think is also interesting. And also maneuvering to protect your flow of funds, right? A lot of countries, they constrict funding, especially by foreign organizations, but there are ways to manage that. So I think it cannot be spoken of openly so easily, but it's a key question for many organizations, whether and how to do that. So if you have a very complicated setting, well, the state is never one thing, but in fragile settings and in settings where the rules aren't clear and lots of competing authorities, it's even more so that you can strategically engage diverse governance levels and diverse entry points and play competing powers against each other. For example, going to one level, if you can't get support there, you go to another level, you go to another authority. That kind of maneuvering, I think, is also very interesting. There's also questions of neutrality, and I have a few of those. This is about then the humanitarian part of things. With advocacy, affected populations speaking for their needs, interests, rights, etc. What does that do to the neutrality of humanitarian action? Does it maybe change the way we see humanitarianism, what it actually stands for, what it actually means, when to be neutral and when not to be neutral? Question of neutrality also come up a lot in these conditions where, client relations really shape your role. You have to really be kind of under the wing of some kind of power to be able to do your work, or when you're part of conflict. That question of neutrality is very difficult. And like I said, these relations between service delivery, policy implementation in diverse settings is very interesting. And then finally, and then I close this exploration of diverse ideas, representation. I mean, if there's no safe, neutral, open space, the tendency is for lots of voices to become excluded and only some elites being able to speak out. Questions of representation are central, I think, to a program seeking to study advocacy like yours. What are challenges for representation? and what are possibilities in diverse settings to advance representation of voices that otherwise remain unheard. I think representation is very important in governance because of the non-electoral groups that have to be part of that, but it has hardly been studied and not at all in an outside of the Western context and transnational advocacy. So I think it's a really a wealth of opportunities on that front as well. Yeah, I want to leave it at this. Thanks a lot for listening, hearing me out. I'll stop sharing my screen then.
Wow, so much information and amazing. Thanks so much, Margit. Yeah, I mean, really, really thanks also to reflect with us, you know, on the project. So much questions. I was taking notes like crazy. So many things that, yeah, definitely after your presentation, I have this urgency that we will have a lot of work to do. There's so many open topics to address. So thanks so much. I don't want to take much of the time. So I want to now give the floor to Gabriela Villasis, who is a PhD researcher in our project and who will be the person commenting now on Margit's presentation. So Gabriela, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rod and Margit. In fact, I have so many questions than comments, I think, at this point. But thank you very much. I think this is more relevant than ever, considering that advocacy efforts are now much needed, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic. Some populations, even if not affected by armed conflict or disasters, have witnessed how easily human rights are being infringed. So I think this is a very important discussion that we should have. I am sharing my perspective about this presentation based not only on the objectives of the Humanitarian Governance project, but also on my own inquiries arising from my work in the humanitarian sector in Colombia. So first, as Rod mentioned before, one of our streams in our research project wants to further develop on advocacy in the context of humanitarian action. So for me, it seems very interesting to connect how Margit has framed these out of the manual aspects in the advocacy and the humanitarian context that we will be researching. It is important to clarify that we are just starting our proposals for the research, the things that we will do in 4 years. So we are also learning a lot about these ongoing discussions. I would like to mention, to take to the discussion a concept that was included in some of the articles written by Margit before. So advocacy in development, for example, has been defined as a wide range of activities conducted to influence decision makers at different levels with the overall aim of combating the structural causes of poverty and injustice. What calls my attention is this wide range of activities. Because we cannot see advocacy as one thing, as one strategy. As Margit has pointed out, it can comprise a lot of different activities and different actors and different dynamics. Particularly in our project, we're interested in that wide range of activities and understanding how these advocacy efforts seek to promote the interests of crisis-affected populations, but also how this can challenge the current humanitarian system. To this end, we want also to go beyond the top-down approaches that, for example, humanitarian diplomacy that has been very common in the humanitarian sector. And this humanitarian diplomacy, which can be seen as advocacy, also has been speaking on behalf of certain populations. So we want to kind of challenge this notion. And maybe we can think about a current example about this humanitarian diplomacy as advocacy. For example, transnational movements speaking up for the Rohingya refugees. This is some kind of advocacy, but who are these voices? Who are they representing? So this is our question. Whose interests are they representing in these advocacy initiatives? We have, as Rod mentioned before, 3 different scenarios: Ethiopia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Colombia. And also we have this topic of climate displacement related situations. At different levels, our 3 cases may be considered volatile or insecure or fragile. It depends on the perspective. Given the more rapid pace and greater volatility of most humanitarian contexts, we will need to move quickly and flexibly to target the advocacy efforts that we are considering or studying or researching. This discussion can also be connected with the current debates in the humanitarian sector about putting people at the center of humanitarian action. We can think of localization, locally led humanitarian action, partnerships, or even complementarity. And this connects with something that Margit mentioned in her presentation about which voices are being heard, the representation, who is doing this advocacy for. I am speaking on behalf of who. So I also agree that we cannot romanticize the local all the time by saying that if it's a local initiative, it's okay and it's not corrupted, because we can also find a lot of power relations underlying these local initiatives. I was trying to understand, based on my own experience, how can a humanitarian advocacy strategy can develop. And one thing that suddenly or that commonly appear in these strategies that are part of the manuals that Margit was mentioning, this is not always fixed or settled, but it's important that you don't have to forget the big picture. We have this big picture, and we also can understand that we can see or focus on the short-term impact or on the long-term impact. This is kind of important when we are talking about humanitarian advocacy, which is not the same that talking about human advocacy in development or in the, as Margit portrays it, as the liberal, stable democracies or states. I would like to finish with 2 ideas. And first, this advocacy in such context, authoritarian, fragile, or hybrid context, could also imply that advocates become targets. And this is very important to take into account. From the experiences that we have in our 3 case countries, and also from others that Margit has also been researching on, advocates can be maybe targeted for violence, threats, or even being killed. In Colombia specifically, we have a very important problem regarding the killings of social leaders that are advocating for different causes. So I was wondering if Margit can share some experience around these advocates becoming targets in such context. And my last comment is also, it's not new, but I was thinking about it before the presentation. It's also about the humanitarian principles and the neutrality aspect of advocacy. I am convinced that even advocacy cannot be obviously neutral, and we should challenge this notion of humanitarian principles all the time. We have to adapt to the new realities. So maybe I'm trying to provoke the discussion with the audience regarding this aspect of being political neutral, but at the same time trying to advocate for specific rights or needs of the crisis-affected populations. So this is kind of my reflection. Thank you, Margit, and Rod, the floor is yours again.
Thanks so much, Gabriela. Wow, great comments, and I can really see, how it links with Margit's ideas. I'm really picking up a lot of this idea of, I mean, Margit calling it, how fluid advocacy is, and you're saying, this wide range of ways of having advocacy. So the question is, how do we study something that is so fluid and it's so contextual and it's so diverse? But also I'm picking up a lot this idea of it's not neutral, but also, especially in conflict-affected settings or fragile settings, it can create more conflict. It can fuel new conflict. And this is something that most people don't ask. It's also not the positive aspect of it, but also, how it can fuel back or can, create new conflict. So there's also something to really pick up. And it's really interesting also idea that also Margit was saying, and you, of the principles and neutrality. I mean, advocacy per se doesn't sound neutral, but many forms of advocacy are portrayed as neutral. So which one of advocacy are we talking? And when people place one card or the other?